Would you feel any differently if my client names were
Erica and Lyle Menendez?
Because if you would, you shouldn't. Because men are human, and boys are human, and it is no different.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Word on Wearside. My name is Rubie and today we will be discussing the case of the Menendez brothers. Eric and Lyle Menendez were just two young boys aged 18 and 21 who killed their parents in 1989 after years and years of abuse. Now I've brought in University of Sunderland's academic lecturer Dan, who also has a PhD in psychology, to have a chat with me about who the real monsters are. Is it Eric and Lyle for killing their parents? Or is it Kitty and Jose Menendez for abusing them since they were only 6 years old? So today I am here with Dan Taylor.
Hello, thank you for having me here.
So we're going to get started. What's your all-rounded overview?
And I think it's not something that is really clear-cut. And I think that allows for a lot of really interesting psychological nuance to be discussed on the subject, I suppose. They obviously had a life that from the outside seemed to be this sort of perfect, idyllic, nuclear family with this sort of, I suppose, dark underbelly. I think like the abuse is playing such a key role in how somebody gets to where they are. And I think, you know, it's something that's becoming more in the public consciousness as well. Like, I think we're really thinking about what is happening to these kids and how far does somebody have to go before we almost take that responsibility off them. What is enough to justify what has happened? And I think the psychology of it is somewhat mixed, and I think the psychology is somewhat muddied by the fact that with a lot of topics like this that evoke that really strong reaction, I think sometimes it's really hard to get past the sort of the emotional subjectiveness of it, so to speak. And I do think you see within law that sort of law and psychology don't really meet, you know, and I think we see a lot of that kind of manifest in how trials are discussed, and sort of, especially in America, where I think, please, anyone listening who feels like this is wrong, I'm more than happy to be corrected, but I do feel like when you see a lot of American trials, particularly the big ones that turn into sort of the media storms, the trials come with a level of sort of theatrics. And it often becomes more about, you know, do you like the person rather than did they do it?
With the case, obviously at the time, I mean, it was only in the 90s, which isn't that long ago, really.
No, not at all.
Like, seriously, it's not. But in America, I mean, when the case was going on, they were convicted in 96, and the whole thing was that they don't believe that a man could be abused, like especially sexually abused, that it was completely like, how could that happen? Why would it happen?
Yeah, because it's so emotive.
Yeah.
I think people struggle with keeping some of the objectivity, and I think because it's so uncomfortable to talk about, it does make it hard to have a sort of appropriate or an objective conversation. And you know, when you look at the law surrounding this stuff, in the UK law especially, and I believe it is also true for US law, but the sort of definition that comes with rape specifically means that essentially it's man, penis, female, vagina, and anything outside of that is legally not fitting within that definition. And I think there is this myth that men are always the perpetrators and only women can be victims. And I think this is kind of harmful on multiple fronts. And I understand why that narrative exists, right?
Yeah.
Like, we know there are problems with, I suppose, let's call them intersexual relations, I guess. We know that traditionally that is always the most public of trials, and like the narrative that often will be set out by a lot of feminist theory is the idea of men as perpetrators, women as victims.
But that's gone so far where it's cases where it is a man that's been assaulted, even by another man, because, I mean, it was his father, or their father, that it's not even believed.
I suppose there's a couple of plates spinning in relation to this for me. I think the first thing is that the freak, what you often see is, I think, sometimes an overestimation of how many men are actually committing these crimes is the first thing. So often what you see is it's not actually necessarily about the maleness of it, I suppose, but it's actually related to these kind of underlying personality traits that sometimes do kind of stretch out into something more extreme and clinical. When you hear them talk about the Menendez dad, you know, there is this level of he's very competitive, he's very driven, he's what is probably seen as stereotypically hypermasculine.
Yeah, definitely.
It's those, I suppose, misconceptions around masculinity that do hurt male victims. Because it's the idea that you must always be up for sex. So regardless of who's doing it, surely that's some, you know, men can't control themselves. They'd have sex with anything if they got the chance. But, you know, we know that that fundamentally isn't true.
No.
And we know that, you know, men can be in positions that are vulnerable. We know that men can be in positions where they are genuinely hurt. And this can be by male perpetrators, but also female perpetrators as well. And I think this is also a really interesting point to touch on as far as the Menendez's mum, who maybe wasn't actively engaging in the abuse the way that we would see dad doing, but certainly had a level of complicitness with this, probably knew it was going on.
Oh, definitely.
You know,
I would personally say definitely knew it was going on. Whenever their father had took them into a room, it was always, don't open it, don't go down the corridor. So she must have had an idea. It
does sound like it was an open secret for them. And I think what you often find with the Menendezes as well is that, and it's a really uncomfortable topic to touch upon, and I appreciate this is going to make a lot of people feel really icky, right? But I do think it's really important to acknowledge. A lot of studies that have looked at people that abuse children specifically have found that actually they're not necessarily what we might call like true paedophiles, in the sense that they're not really attracted to the fact they're children, but they're sadists, because essentially kids are helpless and can't fight back, and that is far more important to their joy.
I always think about if they were sentenced to death instead of life without parole, if they would still be such a big thing, because surely at that point it would have been too late. They would just be dead.
Yeah, that is a really interesting point.
On their second trial, there was a juror that had to be removed because they had a heart attack.
Yes.
And that juror later did an interview and said, I would have put them to death. Obviously, they had a heart attack, like, that can't be helped, but if they didn't, they would be dead. As much as I would like for Eric and Lyle to get out and for them to do all these talk shows for like me and my own interests, I also don't want them to, because I would like to think that they will just go back to living their lives, be with their family, and just be normal people who have missed out on their entire life. Very heated.
Yeah, it's I think it's really important that we learn to have these conversations.
Definitely.
And like, they are exhausting. They are.
It's very intense.
Yeah, I will probably go home and need to take a little nap to recover from, you know, really emotionally evocative, interesting, intense, nuanced, disturbing.
It makes you think.
Yeah.
Like, it's crazy to actually sit and think about, like, this is someone's life.
It's been a true pleasure getting to talk to you and hear
Thank
your
you.
kind of enthusiasm and love for it as well. You know,
Oh, thank
it's
you
been really
for joining
interesting.
me. It's been very interesting.
It has. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too.
You cannot judge the sinner by the sin alone, because you'll never understand what to call the sin unless you look at the person who did it.